Today I'm with Rod Kempe, winemaker of Lakes Folly in the Hunter Valley, and we're going to talk about things past, present and future at Lakes Folly. G'day Rod, how you doing?
Good, Jeremy.
Good stuff. You must have had an interesting moment or two when it was first made clear to you that you'd sort of landed the winemaking job at an Australian icon in Lakes Folly.
Yeah. It was a pretty big deal.
Big deal?
Well, it didn't really faze me that much at the time. I applied for the job, and I don't think I was the only one that threw their hat in the ring. But for whatever reason, they chose me. It must have been the cheapest one, I think. And it wasn't until I was about to go in there that all of a sudden I came to the realisation of just how special the place was and how big shoes there were to fill there after Dr. Lake, because he was one of the real icons of the industry. And it was a real honour and a privilege to go in there.
So he certainly left a big imprint.
Cast a big shadow.
And around the Hunter. And so your background prior to that time, Rod, was mainly Hunter based?
It is, yeah. I'm a Hunter boy, born and bred, and lived there all my life. I left school when I was 15 and did an electrical trades course, and I worked out pretty quickly that I didn't want to be an electrician. And then I travelled a bit. I went around Europe, I went around Australia, and then I came back to the Hunter because that's where my family lived, and I worked in a winery there. It was actually doing the electrical work on a winery, and then it was a lead up to vintage. And then when vintage approached, the winemaker that was there, Ian Scarborough, said to me, "Oh, look, do you want to stay on and work as a cellar hand?" And I said, "Well, I've no idea what that entails, but I'm happy to have a crack, So I did, and I worked that first vintage, and I was the dog's body, I did all the shoveling, all the heavy lifting, all the plunging, the long hours, and I loved it. And I thought, wow, this is what I need at this stage in my life when I'm looking for a direction for a career change. This is what I want. There was a real passion. There was a sense of accomplishment and achievement in creating something. It seemed a worthwhile pursuit, And so I thought, okay, well, if I'm going to do it, what's the best I can do? I'll become a winemaker. And I then enrolled in Charles Sturt University, and it took me 8 years to do a 6-year degree course because I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed. And then it just sort of flowed on from there, and I worked as a cellar hand, and then a cellar foreman, and then an assistant winemaker. And then my real break came in the early 90s when, so that was in 88. So in 93, I was offered an assistant winemaker's position at Rothbury Estate. And Rothbury was an amazing place.
It was a big focus of activity in the Hunter at the time, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And a real icon and such a great philosophy. And I think that this is the thing that the synergy there with Lakes Folly is, Stephen Lake, when I took on the job there, said, well, there's nothing I can teach you about winemaking that you don't already know. But what you need to understand is the philosophy of Lakes Folly. And I thought, what a load of bloody rubbish, Like, what's philosophy got to do with anything? But I've subsequently learned that it's got an awful lot to do with things. And Rothbury Estate had that philosophy, working under Len Evans. Len Evans was an amazing individual, and I learned an awful lot. And I was very fortunate that I had a terrific winemaker there that gave me the licence and the opportunities to do whatever I wanted to do. It was like, well, you want to go and hang yourself here, how much rope do you need? So I just went in and started making all the wines there, and I had a terrific time. And then of course, Rothbury was taken over by Foster's, and that was a really unfortunate time. And the philosophy and the culture of the place changed.
Changed quickly, didn't it?
Changed dramatically overnight. Then in 2000, the job came up at Lakes, and I took on the role there.
Right, as a person, you could hardly be much more different from the very ebullient and very ostentatious Dr. Max Lake, the founder of Lakes Folly. And did you have any sort of relationship with him once you moved into your role?
Not so much, no, because by that stage, Stephen Lake had taken over the winemaking, and Stephen really had pretty much ownership of the place. So while it was Max's dream and vision, he'd passed it on to his son. And Steve didn't really want to... he'd made a decision that he wanted to move on with his life and sell the place. But his dad wasn't happy with that as a decision, because that was like, selling off a baby.
Yes.
And so as such, Max didn't really... I felt a bit daunted, a little bit intimidated by Dr. Lake.
It was easy anyway.
I know. Well, he has that effect on people. So it took me a long time to have any association with him, except towards the end there, when Max's wife passed away, Joy, and she was an amazing lady, absolutely amazing lady. When she died, I thought, no, I've got a real responsibility here to find out what's going on, what's happened and what drove Max and everything. So I rang Dr. Lake and I said, look, Max, I'd really like to come down and spend a bit of time with you. And he said to me, I've been waiting for this phone call. He said, I'll have the champagne on ice, right?
Yeah.
So I went down and I spent an entire day down there. We had lunch and we opened Burgundies and Bordeaux's, and he did a lot of talking, I did a lot of listening. And that was sort of the start of a bit of a friendship. And I said, I'd really love to have you come to the winery and see. And he said, yeah, well, we'll see. Anyway, only about probably 12, 18 months before he passed, he came up unannounced to the winery. He just turned up. And he walked through the place and he was very nostalgic and he was taking everything in, and every step was another story, and we sat down and we tasted through the wines that I'd done, and I looked across the table and I said to him, what do you think? And he said, yeah, good. And I said, he said, I can't stand the fact that I don't own it anymore. And I said, yeah, I can imagine. And he said, but I'm bloody glad you're here. He said, the wines have never looked better. And that was probably the biggest compliment. That was a massive compliment. That was better than wine of the year, or what I mean. It meant more to me to hear that from him. So that was pretty cool.
And you were talking earlier about understanding the culture, the traditions, the philosophy of the place, and that would have been, those conversations you had with him would have sort of injected you, if you like, with some of that feeling and style direction that he was working towards.
Yeah. Well, it was more. He had a vision for the place. He had when he came in to make that wine, the Cabernet, his focus was to make one wine. It was based on a bottle of wine that he tried in 1960 that was 30 years old, and he was so in awe with this wine. And it was a trial wine that was made by Penfolds out at the old Dalwood site in the Hunter Valley. They only ever made a couple of hogsheads of it, and Max got to try this wine, and he drank it and raved about it, absolutely raved about it, wrote a book about this wine. And he thought, right, if this is the sort of wine that can be made in the Hunter, that's what I'm going to do. And that's why, in 1960 he went up there and he started to select sites, choose areas. He spoke with a lot of the locals, all the Tyrrells and the Draytons and the Elliots and guys like that. And he chose Lakes Folly as the site. And he was only ever going to make the Cabernet, and then a few years later he was such a francophile, he loved his champagne, and he thought, I'll plant Chardonnay and I'll make a Blanc de Blanc champagne. So the Chardonnay went in, and but being a weekend place where he would go up on the weekends and do the winemaking just in his spare time, the Chardonnay wasn't ripe enough, and then a fortnight went by before he got back there and it was too ripe.
Yep.
So he turned it into a Burgundy, into a Burgundy still wine. Yep. And he said, I worked out with the sale of that wine, I made so much money I could afford to bathe in French champagne. So that became the start of the Chardonnay.
Yeah. Wow, intriguing.